you.
საღამოშვიდობის მოგესალმებით ყველას, ძალიან დიდი მადლობა მობრძანებისთვის და იმ ინტერესისთვის, რომელიც გამოიჩინეთ დღევანდელი მოვლენის მიმართ. დღევანდელი დღით იხსნება კვირეული, რომელიც ეძღვნება ბატონ კახას. დღეს მისი დაბადების დღეა, თუმცა ცხადია ჩვენ არ გვინდოდა არც მისი საქმიანობის ხასიათიდან, არც მისი სოფხედობიდან გამომდინარე, რომ ქონოდა რაღაც ერთი, ასე ვთქვათ, ბჭყალებში ესეთი მემორიალური სხდომა, არამედ ყოფილიყო იმ საქმიანობას, მის საქმიანობასთან, რეფორმებთან, ფილანტროპიასთან, მეწარმოებასთან დაკავშირებული მოვლენები, რომლებიც ძალიან მოგზაურებული მცდელობა იქნებოდა უბრალოდ აღვეგნიშნა მისი ღვაწლი, მისი დამსახურება ჩვენს წინაშე, ჩვენი საზოგადოების წინაშე და ამდენად ძალიან სიმბოლურია მე მგონი და ძალიან დიდი მადლობა ამისათვის ბატონ სიმეონს, რომელიც სპეციალურად ჩამოვიდა ამ მოვლენისათვის საქართველოში, რომ ეს კვირა იხსნება ერთ-ერთი ბატონ კახას ერთ-ერთი ბოლო ნამუშევრით, რომელიც არის ამ წიგნის, რომელსაც ცხადია მე არ შეგაწყენთ თავს, ნაწილი და აღნიშნავს იმ რეფორმებს, რომლებიც საქართველოში გატარდა და ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანია ჩემი აზრით, რომ ამ წიგში ეს რეფორმები არის გლობალურ კონტექსტში. ჩემი აზრით ეს და არა ვარ ასე ვთქვათ ეული ამ აზრში, ეს არ იყო ადგილობრივი მოვლენა, არც რეფორმების თვალსაზრისით, არც პიროვნების მასშტაბის თვალსაზრისით და ამდენად მე მგონია, რომ უფრო გლობალურ კონტექსტში ეს ყველაზე კარგად იქნება წარმოჩენილი. ძალიან დიდი მადლობა და ეხლა ბატონ სიმეონს ვთხოვ, რომ ესე იგი გაგვიწვეს.
Good afternoon. I'm privileged to be here today, opening this week of lectures and events in honor of my friend Kaka Bendukidze. In fact, this is a project, the book that I'm presenting today is a project that I had discussed with him for a number of months. He has a chapter in this book that is very interesting for everybody who wants to understand the transition period in Georgia, and not just in Georgia. This is a book about all reforms that happened in Eastern Europe. And when you see the book, you would notice that many countries are not at all in this book of our region. Why is that the case? Because in these countries there was not a single reformer that we could identify, so that the country was not included. The majority of countries actually in the region are not included. So that already shows that the work that Kafka and his team did is important, not just for you, for Georgia, but in fact, as I will tell you a bit later in my presentation, is a basis for reform in other countries in this region and actually other countries in the world. Later this week, I'll be presenting this book in Kiev, and you may know, or may not know perhaps, that a number of reforms that the current Ukrainian government is performing are basically copied from here. For example, police reform actually just started 2 weeks ago and is 100% based on the Georgian experience. But in what would follow in my presentation, I'll divide it into two parts. First, a shorter part that will highlight some of the international results, the regional results. And then a second part, which is more focused on Georgia. And I see some reformers in the audience. Perhaps you can help me tell the Georgian part. When we wrote this book, the idea was that I would come and present the non-Georgian chapters, and then Kafka and Mikhail Saakashvili, who is a co-author of the Georgia chapter, will present the Georgian part. Unfortunately, I'm here alone today presenting. Hope that I can do a good job for all of us. Let me also, before start, mention that Kafka did not see this book as it was finalized. He saw it in an electronic format, and that we had agreed to meet in New York in late November of last year, so that I give him the first copies. Literally 2 days after his passing was supposed to be our meeting in New York. But he did see the Georgia chapter in the electronic publishing and was quite happy that he had put the time, because he was saying during the reform process, you know, who has time to write? You know, you either do reforms or you write, and we're doing reforms. So to my knowledge, he had little time to write about all the reforms that had taken place, and I had always tried to convince him and other reformers that well, you need to write so that reformers after you, both in your country and in other countries, maybe countries that you'd never visit, will be able to learn from you and what you've done. So let me go through this. For this presentation. It's about a 20-25 minute presentation, so we have time for questions and answers. Incidentally, the cover is, well, some of you may recognize it, is in downtown Moscow, the financial city in Moscow. But it's also interesting because this shop, which no longer exists, this is a grocery store, actually was in the place of this skyscraper. So it's not just two pictures from Moscow, but this particular Хранительный magazine was actually exactly in the place of this leftmost tower. And it basically shows how little, actually in this case nothing, was absent in the food stores circa 1992 in Russia. So let me talk about the book. What was the idea of writing this book? Last year, for most of Eastern Europe, was the quarter century from the start of transition, 1989. Is considered the year that first in Poland, then in Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and so on, the transition, both the political transition as well as the economic transition started. So since I had the fortune of being involved in the transition in several ways, first as a young, at the time, economist at the World Bank, who worked in many of the countries in the region, basically because I knew Russian, so that was my comparative advantage. Then I was for 4 years in the Bulgarian government as finance minister, deputy prime minister, and managed to do some of the reforms that I had learned about. And I had also extensively written in academic journals about which reforms succeed, which fail, what reforms are needed in various countries. So I thought, let's put together the top reformers from the region, country by country. That's why I told you that a lot of countries are not present, because they don't have top reformers. Romania is an example of that. Slovenia is another example of that. Most of the former Soviet Union, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and so on, are examples of that. But in the countries that it was clear that a single person managed to push through most of the reforms, we asked these people to write a chapter. So we have Leszek Balcerowicz in Poland, Václav Klaus in Czechoslovakia, then the Czech Republic, Mart Laar in Estonia, a few other countries, Slovakia, Hungary, and so on. Then in Russia, interestingly, there are some reformers many years ago, but nobody dared to write in the books. So they came to the conference. We had a conference last May in Budapest. So a lot of the people who I consider reformers, like Anatoly Chubaev, Maxim Boyko, Piotr Aven, were present at the conference, but when we asked them to write the whole 25-year period, not just what they did, but a summary of what happened and what didn't happen, in Russia nobody really committed to writing. We also could not find, we made one exception of a country, which was Ukraine. We could not find a reformer. One reason why Ukraine is in the current situation is because no reforms had happened in these 25 years. But we thought that the country is so important that we asked somebody who had followed Ukraine for a long time to write a chapter of, if there was a reformer in Ukraine, what would they have done? And I think that chapter is one of the most read chapters now in the book, given the chance that Ukraine has to reform. But what we did in this project is that we invited all the top reformers, and actually the Georgia chapter is the only chapter that has co-authors, Mikhail Saakashvili and Kafka Bendukidze. The idea was that this was a country that had a dual challenge, not only economic and social reforms, which is what Kafka Bendukidze did, but also challenges, reforms, let's say, due to a strong and aggressive neighbor, Russia. And that's why we thought that it's useful to describe that experience as well, not knowing at the time that the book started that we would have a current case, or another current case, Ukraine, which also faces the same transition process. And then we invited, at the second half of the book, we invited also some top academics who were following countries, let's say from academia, to do some analytical work of how these reforms turned out to be. There's a lot of talk about reforms, and also the 25 years. One would think, well, we must have transitioned already. So this is a good summary piece, but basically, the future generations, perhaps with the exception of countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Russia itself, don't care too much. This is a picture that basically shows that even what's considered the most reformist country in our region, Estonia, it's true that it started, what we've shown here is average income per capita, and how far it is from the average for the European Union. To basically make the point that even the most reformist country is not at the average. So even for a country like Estonia, not to mention everybody else, they still at least another 25 years, maybe more, of reforms to even get to the average of the European Union. Now it has helped somewhat for this type of pictures that some early European Union countries like Greece and Spain and Italy and Portugal have followed not very wise policies, so their income lately has been going down, and that pulls out the average downwards for the European Union. But the point to make is that even now, after 25 years, we are very, very far from where we need to be as a region. Since I want to focus mostly on the Georgian side, I would summarize just some of the findings in the first part of the book, and maybe the ones that are not so used or not so much discussed in the past. First, what we learned from this book and from the experience of all of these reformers, that basically you have a short window of opportunity. So you come into the government and you have 6 months to a year to do the reforms. If you delay, the chance of you doing reforms is basically zero. There are, of course, some examples of countries that have done reforms later on, but these examples are very few, and they typically happen when the country is completely collapsed, where the economy basically is bankrupt, so the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank comes, and basically they do the reforms for you. But otherwise, if you want to have reforms that are done by the government itself, by the country itself, you have a very, very short window at the beginning of your term to do these reforms. Georgia did exactly that. So in this period between 2004-2005, a lot of the reforms that we are writing about here either started and were even finalized, or at least started, and then there was a period through which they were finalized. But and some reforms lasted 4, 5, 6 years. They're difficult reforms. I'll mention them later. But there are many, many examples of countries where a new government comes, everybody is very optimistic, very excited about it. They say we're going to do great things, we're going to turn around the country, we're going to do great reforms. They spend the first few months either discussing it with the international institutions like the World Bank, IMF, or to go and present around the world what they're going to do. And then the year passes, they've not done much, or the half year. And after that, the reform doesn't happen. As I mentioned, many examples. The previous Ukrainian government, which we all had very big hopes last year after Euromaidan, the first government had good people in it, talked a lot, didn't do anything. So now, with the new government, Ukraine hopefully has a chance to do some much-needed reforms. The second point is a point that was often, at the time, pushed to reformers wrongly by the international financial institutions, including at the time my own institution, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, in a different format, and a lot of academics. And they were basically saying, to have a transformation process, you need to change the institutions. So basically, if you just start doing some reforms, it's not going to work because the people's mindset is not set on reforms. So even, let's say, if you do a reform in customs, let's say, and even if you replace everybody in customs with new people, they're quickly going to learn how to steal and contraband and so on, because this is the mindset of customs. Why do you go to customs or the police? To get bribes. So unless you have a very pronounced, longer-term institutional reform, you're basically not going to succeed. And there were, at the time, and still are, quite a few top academics, including Joe Stiglitz, who got the Nobel Prize, not for this work, fortunately, for other work, a number of other Nobel Prize winners who actually subscribed to this scenario, that without a big upfront institutional reform, which can last a number of years, you have no hope of changing the mindset of people and then changing reforms. The reforms that started in Georgia, which other countries successfully did as well, like Leszek Balcerowicz in Poland, had a different viewpoint, which is that you come, you have a short window of opportunity that I said, you blitz. So you do as many reforms as you can do and as fast as you can do. And then you rest a bit, see which reforms you haven't done, and then while the population and your opposition is still confused, do these reforms as well. And only then you can think of institutional changes. If you sit and think of institutional changes, first, people don't like change to begin with, any change. Even if it's good for them, the psychology, our psychology, the psychology of people is such, is that if somebody asks me, you've lived so far this way, do you want to live another way? Well, maybe, maybe not, I'm not too sure. So there is this psychological effect. But the other effect is that behind every institution, there are a lot of people who profit from its inefficiency. So if you go to, let's say, imagine that in this, actually we need a much bigger hall, but in this room we bring all the top customs officials of the time, and we say, good news, we have a new government, we're going to be better, no corruption. What are they going to say? Absolutely no corruption. They'll promise immediately, and you'll say, let's reform everything, and they'll say, absolutely, let's reform everything. And then they'll leave and they'll say, this guy is crazy, so let's either take him out or make sure that we write that he's the most corrupt person, or basically do something that he's not the minister or whoever it is. So they will resist change. So for that reason, you need to, while they're not prepared for what you're going to do, you need to basically do it very, very quickly. This is also the way to reduce corruption. Perhaps there are many lessons from the Georgian experience. I've asked actually the chapter of this book, the Georgia chapter, to be put on the website so you can read it. But one of the best examples is what happened, actually most people write about the traffic police. I think what happened in customs here is already used in a number of countries around the world, which is that one day you meet with everybody and say, congratulations, you were customs officials or police officers until today, and from tomorrow you're going to do something else. Good luck, and wish you all the best. And then you replace everybody, you replace the whole structure. As I mentioned, as of April 1st, Ukraine is trying to do this with their traffic police. But they didn't dare do what was done here in Georgia. They said, we'll first do Kiev, see what happens, and then we'll see whether we bring it to other places. I can tell what's going to happen. There are going to be lots of complaints in Kiev, and the current Ukrainian government is going to be afraid of continuing, so they're going to stop halfway. In my own experience as finance minister, which was 2010, 2011, I actually did a similar exercise with the Bulgarian customs office, which was as corrupt as, or maybe not as corrupt as the Georgian customs office at the time, but similarly corrupt, let's say. And basically we replaced at once 100% of all the top and middle management. And I had learned this from working here. Otherwise, I probably would have tried to reason with them, to tell them that they're not as efficient with others. They would have written stories about, they would contribute to stories in the media how terrible as a minister I was, and there would have been a prolonged fight to do this reform, perhaps never to succeed. But we learned from the experience here how to do it, and a number of other countries, not just in our region. I've been in countries as diverse as Colombia in Latin America, as Vietnam in East Asia, that have done this type of reforms. Otherwise, opposition grows, but the likelihood for corruption actually perversely increases, because now as a customs officer or as a police chief, I know that perhaps my job is not guaranteed for too long, so in the few weeks or months that I have left, I better steal a lot, so otherwise I'm going to be unhappy. So if you have partial reforms, what happens is that corruption actually perversely doesn't decrease, it shoots up very, very quickly because of this incentive, still very fast. The third point was one of the surprise points in this book. I don't know whether it's relevant for Georgia, or at least in the early transition whether it was relevant for Georgia. But what we've discovered, and this was not much written about before, is that in a number of countries in the region, still today, the old communist time secret police basically has been in charge of the country, either expressly, as in Russia, for example, now, or Serbia, where very top government officials are part of the old secret service apparatus, let's say. But there are a number of other countries in the region where if you follow the whole 25 years of experience, you would see most of the top politicians in one way or another being either directly part of the old secret service or being influenced through party politics, through election contributions, through businesses with the old secret police. And the result of that is that there is a lot less desire for reform because the secret police was probably the most, or one of the most conservative and retrograde part of the old regime. And the last point I'll show you with some examples quickly is that we generally, until recently, have thought of the transformation process as a stop-and-go process, but at least in one direction, that maybe reforms happen or reforms don't happen, but at least you don't have reversals of reforms where a country reforms for a while very significantly and then decides to go the opposite way. This, until very recently, was not a feature of the transformation process that we had seen. Now, unfortunately, it has become a feature of the transformation process. I'll show you some former secret police. You know President Putin, he looks it as well. But there are many others on the picture next to it. It's not Gaddafi, who probably was also former secret police, but next to him is actually Bulgaria's twice president, Georgi Parvanov, who was our president for 10 years, who before that was head of the Socialist Party, is now actually a leader of a party in the Bulgarian parliament. So one of Bulgaria's most successful politicians, former secret service. It's good that he now created his own party because that party has a lot of secret service people, so I can have a lot of pictures next time we present. But as I mentioned, now, as of today, there are about 6 countries of the 28, 29 transition economies where either the top politician or one of the top 3-5 politicians in them, prime minister, president, and so on, is member of the former secret police, which after 25 years of transition, not just former secret police, former communist secret police, doesn't bode well for how successful we've been in the transition process. The last part of this regional discussion would be on reform reversals, because I think this is something that we've only recently seen, with the exception perhaps of Russia, where the reversal already happened about 10, 12 years ago, but we are now seeing how fundamental it is. So I've actually started here with an example with Russia. Russia, if you looked at Russia, let's say in the mid-90s or even late 90s, you would have said that Russia is one of the fastest reforming countries. In the early 90s, it had the Gaidar government, where many of the people I mentioned, like Anatoly Chubais, Maxim Boyko, Pyotr Aven, were part of. And then in the early 2000s, it had another, not a full government, but some government that had reformers, like the finance minister Alexei Kudrin, German Gref, to some extent, Minister of Economy, who also tried to do sort of a second round of reforms. Not very successfully, but they at least tried. But all of this stops around 2003. And from 2003 now, for basically a dozen years, Russia has either done nothing, for example, in pension reform, or actually has reversed some of the reforms. I give here the example that while, let's say, by 2003, the banking sector was mostly in private hands, more than 50%. If you look at it today, it's probably already 80% in government hands. And when the government owns the banking sector, silly things happen in every country around the world, not just in Russia. But it's not only in Russia. I here illustrate some examples from pension reform, basically because the reformers wrote about pension reforms. I can give other examples, where after some fairly successful reforms introducing private second pillar, third pillar of pension, first the Hungarian government under current Prime Minister Orban in his second term at the time, he's now in his third, and then Poland and Slovakia basically went back to essentially a fully funded, fully state-owned pension system, thus reversing reforms that were done about a decade or so before that. And lately, I also give my example, so you don't, my country's example, so you don't think that I'm biased in favor of Bulgaria. But there are many other countries that are examples. In the last few years, somewhat linked with the Eurozone crisis, a number of countries has gone back to this issue of should the state control a lot of assets? And what are strategic sectors where the state should have large ownership? In the past, it was thought that energy is such a sector, but now a number of other sectors have been decided to be of interest to various governments in the region, and hence to renationalize. I give here an example from Bulgaria, where last year a few small so far, fortunately, and the government fell, so hopefully not anymore, but a few examples where random industries, chemicals industry, for example, machinery industry, the state or the government decided, well, these are strategic industries for us, so government should run them, which we know from communist times what happens if the government runs businesses. They go bankrupt sooner or later. And while I'm sure that there will be a lot of research coming, what's interesting to know is where is this coming from? So is this just a feature of very difficult financial, economic situation? One can argue this. I mentioned already Eurozone crisis has prompted a few reasonable countries, I would say, like Slovakia, to do silly things. Or is it something else? Is it the rise of populists to power? So you can say, well, we can understand Hungary because of Prime Minister Orban, we can understand Russia because of President Putin, who are thought to be populists. But what about other countries that are not expressly led by expressly populist people? Here I have not mentioned Georgia intentionally, so we can talk about it later. But one feature which is coming for the first time in our region as a subject for research is also the loss of memory. That early on in the transition process, in every country in the region, if you asked people, do you want the previous regime or do you want something new? Something like 80% would say the previous regime was corrupt, deeply inefficient, terrible, undemocratic, so we want something new. But with time, there are new generations. They don't remember the previous regime. By now, they're already at universities, like some of you probably were not born in 89, 90, when the transition started. So they don't have direct memories of communism, socialism. And as a result, their memories are not, they don't remember the lines, the empty stores, the lack of, well, in Georgia, you probably do remember the lack of electricity, but in most countries you don't. So people somehow think of socialism, and actually it was fine, you know, it was very equal, it had some nice features, so you don't feel bad about it. And this with time would increase, so this loss of memory of the previous regime increases with time, which allows populists to come and say, well, what was wrong with the previous regime? Everybody had the same opportunities, you know, everybody was equal, it was great. And if you don't remember it, you'd think, well, and if you are not educated, most importantly, you'll probably think, yeah, they may be right. And this is a feature, again, not just of a few countries, across our region. If you look at the rise of so-called populist parties who preach this agenda of basically socialism or communism, in some features was a good time. So let's go back to some of it. It's increasing across the whole region. So I'll show you some pictures or some data from my own country, Bulgaria, and then we switch to Georgia. This is just, I'll go quickly through this just to illustrate the point that I'm making. In Bulgaria, we have the same survey done basically every year as part of a census. So lots of people respond to this survey. So at the end of last year, this survey asked the question, are you familiar with Bulgaria's economic development under communism? Speaking to this point I just made. And if you look at the young people, they basically say, no, we are not familiar. It's not studied in high school, it's not studied at the university, so basically 80%, 79% say not familiar at all, and another 15% say we are somewhat familiar. So basically only 2% of the young people in Bulgaria currently say we know something about the old socialist economic system. When you go to the older generation, they do remember. So they have these direct memories, whatever these memories are, but they do remember. But memory loss is very significant, unless, of course, you have research, unless you have books like this, and people read the books, not just having them. And this is perhaps the most interesting characteristic. It would be interesting to do this in Georgia with Shevardnadze or the predecessor of Shevardnadze to see what happens. Very large part of the population asked about Todor Zhivkov was, for those who are not familiar, I think it's written, yes. He was one of these very long-term communist dictators. By the end, he was so senile that people actually started liking him because he couldn't say anything. He was confusing which year he was in. In state television, he was congratulating everybody for New Year's, even though it wasn't New Year. So he was so senile that it was almost comical. But in 1991, there is a Pole, still alive at the time, Todor Zhivkov, and people asked, do you approve of him? So basically, how do you think of our former secretary of the Communist Party? And you can see here that 76% say basically he's bad, he's terrible, we don't approve of him. Same question asked, 23 years later, late last year. Look at the difference, 55% basically say he was a great guy, we can go drink beer, a nice guy. And only 25% say the guy was not good. In this period, of course, he's done nothing, so it's not that somehow he did great things after 91. He was not in power anymore, so he was retired, and then he passed away in year 2000. So it's not that he did something to change people's opinions, just the memory of people changed during this time. I point this because this is very dangerous for reformers. Especially if people don't work to set history right. So this is one of the reasons for this book, and I hope that within Georgia, in Georgian, in English, there is a lot more being done. Otherwise, people forget. Both they forget about the reforms, how difficult the reforms were, the personal struggle of reformers, but they also forget, like I show you in this picture, what was it before? Why do you reform? So interesting, since I've presented this in a number of countries, I have such pictures. Researchers from Poland, from Slovakia have been sending me such pictures to illustrate that the same is true in their country. So if you ask for the last Polish communist leader, do you approve or not? Exactly the same picture shows up in Poland. And not surprisingly, to finish on this topic, when you ask how do you evaluate Bulgaria's post-communist development, most people say it's not successful. There are many problems, no question, but the same people who say, well, we approve of Todor Zhivkov, without actually having witnessed his stay in power, say, well, basically the reforms don't work, is another way to present this slide. Many conclusions, read the book. So now we go to Georgia. This chapter you should have. I have asked that it's also put on the website. The book is sold also on the internet, so you can have access to it, and it is in your library as well. So where does Georgia start? Georgia started the transition fairly late, basically because, again, most of you probably remember the Shevardnadze period. At the time I started, I should say here, a bit of a personal testimony. I already mentioned that I joined the World Bank in the mid-90s. Very young, straight out of school, was still working on my dissertation, PhD dissertation in economics. And at the time at the World Bank, there were very few people who knew Russian and German and had basically Western-style economic education. So I was shipped around the region. My first country was Moldova, second country Georgia, but I've worked in nearly every country in this region for a period of many years. Early on because there are no other takers, and then later on because I actually developed some knowledge about reforms. And I had actually come to do reforms with the World Bank team in Georgia already in 99, 2000, 2001, before the Saakashvili Bendukidze government. At the time of President Shevardnadze, I still remember he had one main economic advisor, his name was Basilia, I think, who basically we needed to talk to do anything. And we talked a lot and nothing ever happened. At the time I remember this period, I was relatively young, so could live under stress. There was no electricity, hardly any electricity. There were no good hotels other than the Sheraton, which is now in reconstruction. So we had rented with some friends of mine, colleagues, an apartment just above the parliament, and basically lived there. And at the time it was a luxury. We actually got a generator, electric generator. So nobody else had electricity. We had the electricity in the building. And we were very popular with the then government, who didn't want to meet us during the day because they didn't do any reforms. But we did basically dinner parties at night, and everybody came because we had electricity and we had food. And we actually had even a piano, so that was the extra benefit. So we tried for about 2 years to do reforms, any kind of reform. Sectoral reform, enterprise reform, education reform. We brought all different types of experts, and basically nothing happened. So after about 2 years, some of my colleagues liked being here just because of the cuisine and the wine, so they stayed anyhow. But I said, I have better things to do than just to waste my time with this government. So when you're ready to reform, call me. I'm going to other countries, which I did. And then when the revolution happened, and then when Kaka came to power, I was one of the first people that the World Bank said, you should go back. And I said, well, but by now you have many other people who spend a lot of time. They said, well, Minister Bendukidze says that the World Bank is full of communists, so he doesn't want to work with the World Bank, and that's why we're sending you, because you're not a communist. So, okay, that sounds very promising. So I came here, and I still remember this first meeting. You've hopefully all met Kaka at some point or other, or worked with him. So I went to his office. He has these glasses that, always like this. So he looks above them and he says, who are you? I say, World Bank. I've worked in the whole region. I have lots of research you can look at and so on. He said, yeah, I don't want to work with the World Bank. You guys are just talking, but you're not supporting us in reforms I know from other countries. And basically he showed me the doors. I said, go away. Okay, fine. So, what do? I go away. But fortunately, unlike most of my colleagues, I had written a lot of academic articles that are not communist by those who've read them in spirit. So he gave me his card. So I sent him an email basically saying, so just read these 2 or 3 articles if you have time, and then I'm around for another 2 days drinking wine. So, so if you want, we can meet again. If not, on to the next country. So he called me like at 2 a.m. in the morning, which, I first thought was a joke. Why would a government official be awake at 2 a.m., much else to work? And he invited me to a meeting, but not at a hotel, I forget, some like strange place. So I first was afraid. I thought, these guys want to take me out, so I'm definitely not going to this. So I said, no, I insist on meeting in the government offices. Now that I think they can take me out there as well, but anyhow, it seemed safer. So we met like at 3 a.m. In the government offices, and he told he was alone. Who else would work at 3 a.m.? So he told me that we want to do this. Do you have expertise in the World Bank? And I said, no, sorry, we cannot do this, especially not that fast. But later we agreed that on some of the reforms we can perhaps help. And the government actually did the other reforms without us and without other people anyhow. But this is my first story with Kafka. And then in the next many years, we've met many times. But anyhow, Georgia. So this is the chapter that that Kafka wrote, and it starts like this. This is the first sentence of the chapter. Imagine a country in which the government does not control 3 regions that represent 20% of its territory. So it starts with this non-economic, basically, reforms that have taken place. There is no reliable electricity. Again, I remember this fairly painfully. Roads are riddled with potholes. I remember that even at the World Bank, I had to drive with a off-duty police officer who at the back of his car had this Shapka police thing. So when somebody stops us, he would do this. You know, I also have the, you know, I'm also from the police, so don't stop me. So that was the period next. The top export is scrap metal, at the time I mean. And this is Georgia in late 2003. He put this in one sentence, I just divided it, but this is basically the first sentence of Georgia. Again, those who remember sort of take this as given. Those who do not remember understand how difficult it is to basically reform in this kind of environment, and especially where to start. Because it's one thing to say pension system doesn't work and the educational system is corrupt and inefficient. So let's reform pensions and let's establish private universities. It's quite another thing that you have a long list of things that you need to reform. And that's basically what the government started to do. Most of this happened between 2004 and around 2007 or so. There were some further reforms, education reform, for example, that happened later on. But the main bulk of the reform happened in about a 3 years time. And some of this is in detail described in the chapter. What the chapter is most useful for is that it goes into detail to talk not about the reforms that happened, but also how they happened and where the problems were. I think this is most useful from a reformer perspective, because if I'm a reformer or a potential reformer in a new government, like the current Ukrainian government, and if somebody tells me, good news, Georgia did it, they just fired everybody from the police in one go and then eventually rehired them and good things happen, it's not very useful for me, because I don't know, well, is it really how it happened? Did they think of this at once, or did they do it as pilots, like I gave you the Kiev example? How did it go? So the benefit of this chapter is that it goes and explains the thinking. We first thought this, but then we decided against, so we decided to do that. And there is quite a lot of description, reform by reform, tax reform, privatization, visa liberalization. I was very excited about this. It always annoyed me that I had to have visas when I come. So this is one of the reforms I was always complaining, well, can't we, you know, why are you, given that you're saying that your border police is so corrupt, why are you entrusting them to give me visas and to let me in and out of the country? You know, I give them $20, I'm in. So why bother? So this was one of the most significant reforms actually ever undertaken. At a first glance, it's not an economic reform, but it actually is, because it allows people to come for the first time to Georgia to see whether this is a country to invest and so on. And we go all the way down the list to this Lazika, the unfinished, in Kacha's words, reform, which I was not part of. This happened later on. There are, in fact, some reforms here that are not mentioned, like the education reform. I've probably spent, I don't know, many meetings with Kafka just discussing educational reform. I was not an education specialist then, so I didn't know much about educational reform, so it was mostly him talking. But we had lots of discussion how to go about it, and how to go from 100% state-owned system, but with some established universities where reputation plays a role. So you can say that they're inefficient, corrupt, and so on, but if you're to become an undergraduate and the parents decide in most cases where you go to study, you know, they're going to say go to whichever University of Tbilisi or the state university, because that's where your father went, and this way I went, and it was great years. That's when we got married. Beautiful time. So you should go there. So there is this bias. I see it now since some of my time I spend in Russia running them a small but very good private university, the New Economic School. And I ask students, why would you ever think in economics and finance going to Moscow State University, Moskovsky Государственный университет? Professors there, like communist times, they still think that Marx is alive, and they teach this stuff. Why would you ever go there? And you know what then? Well, because my mother went there or wanted to go there, my father wanted to go there but couldn't, and now I can. Wasted opportunities, but a major reform to happen. So we discussed it many times, how to do a national exam, which is a reality. And this university has the top, usually the top students, which then creates a better environment for later on. How to allow private universities, and not just universities, high schools, at every level, private universities to develop, how to create research environment in them, which at the time, given that there was still no electricity when we were discussing that, was a very far-reaching reform. But most of you, I mean the students, are now beneficiaries of that. So many reform examples. I hope that some of the people who did work with Kafka on his reform team can write some of the reforms that did not make it to this study. One thing that I was directly involved with Kafka by the time that I had started coming again to Georgia is that I was the creator and manager of the World Bank's Doing Business Index, which in essence basically says governments are inefficient and corrupt. So wherever you can take them out of economic regulation, take them out, because they mostly create problems. It has other more sophisticated research rationale, but that was the basic rationale. And it happened that 2003 was the first year that we did an international ranking. And Georgia ranked 112 among, at the time, 181 countries. By now, there are almost 200 countries in this ranking. Basically, behind it were, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, who had not yet heard of regulations, and then a lot of Africa, a few Latin American countries. Basically, this was who was behind. In 2005, we had these discussions with Kafka and his team. Vato was already present. Tamuna, you probably know who I'm talking about, was already on the team, and they said, we want to target being a top 10 country in doing business. And I told them, that's it, I'm leaving, it's becoming a bit ridiculous to work with you guys, cannot happen. Just impossible to do it, so I'm not going to be part of this exercise. And actually, I was not part of this exercise. I was sending other members from the doing business team to write, to learn basically what reforms are happening. And to my amazement and the amazement of the rest of the world, I think in 3 years, maybe 4 years, I forget, 4 years, let's say, Georgia went from 112 to 8th, and actually kept, so they managed to reach top 10, and kept the number 8 spot for a few years. So they lost it last year. Not commenting on the current government, just mentioning that from 8th they went to 15th, I think now. But for a long time, Georgia was basically the only country which wasn't very rich that was in the top 10. And since then, Georgia actually has continues to be an example for many other countries to follow of how to achieve this. Not only that, but as I've written here, in some examples like property registration, Georgia became #1 in the world, so the most efficient country in the world, and I think continues to be. I don't know whether that changed, but continues to be. On business licenses and permits, at some point it was #2, maybe still is the case. So in some examples, it was really best of the best. I mentioned already reform reversals. Some of the reforms, like labor reform, was changed to some extent. Some other reforms in customs, at least I know, were not improved, let's put it that way, last year. So as a result, the ranking has changed. But it wasn't just doing business. When Kaka and his team and then prime ministers were increasingly different prime ministers taking credit for this work. So when they traveled internationally, they often started their presentations with doing business and this successful reform. So among the international economics, at least, community, I would say that Georgia is still mostly known for the success of this work. But I think the most exceptional outcome, this is how it's written, this is not my view, this is how the chapter ends, and I'll end my presentation with this. So this is how Kaka Bendukidze wrote, I think, the last sentence of this chapter. He says, however, notwithstanding all of these many reforms that we've told you about, the single most exceptional outcome of the reform was the peaceful and democratic change of government in 2012 after the parliamentary elections. In other words, we've done a lot of things. Many things were unfinished and hopefully can be picked up in the future. But one of the results is that we did change the mindset of people in the government as well as outside of the government, with the result that Georgia, unlike any other country in this particular part of our region, has had a peaceful transition of power, hopefully the first of transitions to come. I'll stop here. I spoke more than 25 minutes, so apologies. And if you have questions or comments.
თუ ვინმეს გნებოდათ კითხვის დასმა, მოვალთ თქვენთან და მიკროფონში შეგიძლიათ რომ კითხვა დაუსვათ.
Thank you very much for your clear exposition of the topic. I have a question which has maybe no bearing immediately on the topic you exposed here, but I would like to know your opinion about Samuel Huntington's theory of clash of civilizations, which was very popular some 10, 15 years ago, as exposed to the theory of the dialogue between civilization that originated here in this country and then went to Iran, and the Prime Minister Khatami presented it at the United Nations organizations in New York as his own, so to say, theory of the dialogue between civilizations as opposed to the clash of civilizations.
I understand. Does this microphone? Yes, it works. Maybe I'll answer one by one and then we can gather questions and comments later on. The clash of Huntington's clash of civilization concept, I think lately has become very popular, first interestingly in academia, because academics, I think, have longer-term memory than politicians, but lately a number of politicians also talk about this. In the last year or two, it's spoken in at least two conflicts. One that you mentioned, the conflict that, well, the conflict didn't originate from this region, but what followed, what you referred to in the Middle East, and by now, not only in the Middle East, is considered by many a clash of civilization. And a smaller group of people think of the Ukraine conflict also as a type of clash of civilization, this time between Russia, or the Russian way of thinking, and the Western way of thinking. I make a distinction between the two because on the one, perhaps like yourself, the first one, I think that at least the way that the theory was developed, we can say that there is such a clash of civilization. That something that a few years ago, certainly politicians wouldn't have admitted. So you remember that not just this US administration and Europeans, but successive administrations have had this view, which is that basically we know the way forward for any country in the world. It's democracy, it's free elections, it's this type of economic reforms that we describe here, is the change of institutions after that, judicial reform, educational reform, and so on. And maybe different countries would take different time, but it's unquestionable that this is the way forward, that this is how progress, economic as well as political progress happens. Now, after certainly the last decade or so, there are a lot of doubters of this view, basically that there is harmonization and way of working together in the world, and would subscribe to the clash of civilizations concept. And they basically make the following argument. So we tried in a number of mostly Middle Eastern, Arabic or Muslim countries to go this way. And there were elections in a number of them, but actually the elections didn't come up with the results that we expected. So instead of, somehow people electing democratic, free-thinking people, the opposite is happening in nearly every country that goes basically, Libya is a good example. I showed you Gaddafi in the picture. Well, this was only 4 years ago. So if you asked most politicians, but also analysts, what would happen after Gaddafi, they would say, oh, it's great improvement. Or what would happen in Egypt after Mubarak, great improvement, and so on. You look only 4 years after that, and actually in the case of Libya, the country is disintegrating. So it's not that you can say it's going backwards, it's just disappearing as a country. Countries like Egypt have basically gone into what's equivalent to civil wars, their economies have struggled very significantly. So this concept of there is one way forward seems to have, at least in one region, but an increasing region, many countries are now examples of this, is not working out. It is, I think, for the next few years, both for researchers and for politicians to say, is this just a temporary setback? You remember, even though I don't subscribe to Marx, I have studied Marx as well, and you remember that he was basically saying in the dialectic materialism that progress is like a spiral. So maybe we're at the bottom of the spiral, and then you go up. So maybe what we are seeing in this region is a temporary setback. I personally doubt it. I would more subscribe to the clash of civilizations idea in that region. But let's wait and see. If it is a clash of civilization, it's a big problem for all of us because we don't have enough understanding of what to do from here on. Because you've already unleashed it, so you cannot go back and say, it's too bad that we unseated Gaddafi, we now should get him back. Well, we cannot. Not that anybody would say that, hopefully, but we need to think of other ways to reform not just the economy, but also politics. And at least I'm not aware of how you do that. And just to finish, as I mentioned, a group also thinks that, increasingly thinks that Russia or the conflict with Russia in the last few years is an example of such clash of civilization. I don't think so. I think that the majority of Russians and the Russian population is fundamentally has the same values as the rest of Europe. So I don't think there is a clash of civilization there at some broad spectrum. Certain politicians have a clash of civilization in their mind, and that can take some time to resolve. But I think, and since I have some experience in Russia now, I think that that is not an example of a clash of civilization. But one example is enough, more than enough, because we don't know how to deal with it. And you see every day a number of people beheaded, a number of people killed in that part of the world in a very barbaric way. And we don't know how to respond. You know, we just haven't, as policymakers, we haven't learned about what to do in this kind of cases. So hopefully soon we have an answer. Maybe you have an answer, in which case you would help everybody.
Some 20 years ago.
Yeah. No, it comes out when something is very difficult to resolve. And you're right, 25 years ago, even in transition, people were saying it would take, 50 years for these guys to become like us in Western Europe. Well, by now, Greece is poorer and less well managed, not just Greece, Portugal and so on, than Estonia and Slovakia and so on. So for some countries, it takes 20 years or even 10 years. But when you face such a fundamental challenge as you face now with ISIS, with Al-Qaeda, with all of these things, and they're proliferating. It's not that you have one or two. They've really spread very fast. We don't have a meaningful response, unfortunately.
If I may. Hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation, and I would also like to thank the organizers of this week, because indeed it's a great job. I would like to congratulate Vato, his team, Natia, Shako, Aleko, everyone who really contributed, because Kafka Bendukidze really was a remarkable person. He was very important to my country. He was, as Vato mentioned in the opening remarks, he was very important for the region, and he was really, his importance was beyond the state of Georgia. And I shared it with my friends, and I would also like to share it now, that I really envy the students which are here, because had I been a student and had I been inspired by such a person as Kafka during my student years, I would really be a different person. So I really congratulate this cohort. Now, with regards to the questions and to the presentation, so you have here the quote which Kafka said, that one of the most exceptional outcomes was the peaceful transition of power. He also admitted that it was a huge step forward, but we stepped into a big pile of shit.
Dirt.
Yeah. So, everyone agrees that we're now facing a kind of a reversal, which you mentioned here. So, my question is, with the examples which you have reviewed in your book, like examples of the Eastern European countries, what happens after these reversals? Have there been any successful outcomes, successful reversal of these reversals? Have there been such cases, and what to expect? Mm-hmm. And another point, it's more like a comment. You had their reasons for these reversals, and you mentioned the former KGB, some secret police, and I wonder whether you have encountered in any of the countries a situation which we had here, where a very powerful interest group, a very powerful opinion-making group like Soviet intelligentsia, they played a huge role in reversals in this country. So, was this the same situation in any of the countries you reviewed? Thank you.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, one of the, or two of the interesting findings that were not, to my knowledge, discussed in any academic or other writing so far in our region was the role of, I here mentioned the former Secret Service. You can think of other parts of the old regime as being like former Secret Service, in the sense that they have a vested interest in, one, pointing out that the past was better than the present, even if they couldn't change anything about it, or two, more dangerously, if somehow they are in a position to, at some point in time, to try and do reversals. So you mentioned Soviet intelligentsia as one such example. One of the reforms actually that's in the Bulgaria chapter that was not formally part of what my work in Bulgaria was, but I was very excited and we did manage to do it, is like every socialist country, we had a Bulgarian Academy of Science, which had a committee that decided everywhere in the country who would become a doctorant, aspirant, and so on, basically, so who would have advanced degree. We managed to get We managed to get rid of this in 2011. At the time, the average age of the people in the various committees in Bulgaria was 76. So 76 on average year-olds were deciding whether somebody in, let's say, computer science would become a PhD or not. Now, in many, if it's archaeology, there are many examples where actually the more experience you have as a researcher, the better you are. I can think of many, but there are a number of sciences where basically unless you've been active in the last 10, 15 years, you're completely out. The science has changed so much. So this is an example where in various fields, not just in education in Bulgaria, but in various other fields, there was a group similar to the group that you mentioned, which was always against whatever reform was happening, and we managed, fortunately in that case, to get rid of the way that it was organized. But to go to your first question, so what happens in reversals? Are there reversals to the reversals, or is there going back to normal? In most countries there is actually. So we have so far two countries that I mentioned, Hungary and Russia, where now for a few years the very top of the political ladder, not just one person, because people, I think, wrongly point out, well, if not for Orban or if not for President Putin, Russia or Hungary would be different. It's not at all clear who the alternative to that is. Knowing the political spectrum, you can actually do even worse in these cases in terms of reversals of reforms and so on. But these countries are the exceptions. In most countries, I showed you Bulgaria. So Bulgaria between 2013 and early 2014 had a sort of reversal in a number of reforms. But people had gotten used to basically the European way of life. And the moment that the reforms started hitting on some European fundamentals, and the European Union started making points that, look, you know, you joined the European Union, but now you're not going in the same way that you've promised earlier, they didn't last. So this particular government, who did a number of reversals, lasted for about 15 months and then just couldn't, due to popular discontent, couldn't stay in power. There are a few such examples in the rest of the region where you stay for a while, managed to do a lot of bad things. You know, the 15 months in Bulgaria, this socialist-led government probably brought the country 4 or 5 years back. So we would now need 4 or 5 years to get to the point that we were in early 2013. There are such examples in Croatia that I can think of, in Slovakia, a few others. But in most of this, if you've done already a lot of reforms, which was not the case, as I mentioned, in Russia for a decade or so, the population turns, not in the first year, but relatively quickly. So in short, do I think that this reversal is a longer-term effect in Georgia? No, I don't think. I think that things have changed quite fundamentally here, thanks to the several years of reform, and people quickly can figure out, is this what we want to do? It's one thing to promise, you know, it's very easy to come to power and basically say your salaries will double, your pensions will triple, everybody will have, you know, the brand new computer and so on. It's quite another thing to implement it. And, you know, a government comes, does a few things, things are not great, you know, the economy is going down, things don't look that good. It doesn't take a long time for the population to figure it out. And then to finish the answer for these groups that you mentioned, yes, they can delay progress, but I think by now in nearly every country they cannot completely stop and reverse progress. Ultimately in countries like Georgia, especially with the European Union Association Agreement, now you have Europe, which also has an interest in the success of Georgia. I think is just, let's say, a short delay on the way to progress.
By the way, I understand very well what is universals in linguistics, but it's difficult to understand what is universals in economics or politics.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah, agree with you.
Could you define it closer?
Well, the point that I was making is that there linguistics is a good example. I'm quite interested in archaeology. There are a number of areas where experience helps you tremendously because you learn from the past, and the more you do so, law is another such area, for example, the better. There are some areas, perhaps because they are new areas of study, in most cases they're very new. They develop very rapidly. And in these areas, unless you are part of it now or have been lately, it's difficult to be on top of your science, and it's difficult to be of this assistance, of this knowledge, universal knowledge, as you say, that you're on top of the profession and can advise others. That was my my point.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the very interesting lecture. I do understand the question is going to be pretty cheesy, but I have to ask it. Imagine a country like Georgia in 2003 with everything the same, quite the same, a new government comes, the government with the best intentions imaginable, and they do want to change things, they want to make the country better. What should they start with? What should the first step, first reform, if you would, should be? Like, should it be considering human rights? Should it be something economical? Or thank you.
In my view, the first thing that they should do, which goes towards the previous question as well, is see where the areas of resistance to reform. So which are the parts of society that have kept the current situation the way that it is, if the rest of the world is changing. So in some cases this can be, as in the case of Bulgaria, the former secret police, so you immediately need to do something about that. You saw, not coincidentally, that in Ukraine, I think the first meaningful law, there were a lot of laws that were not that meaningful, that took place in Ukraine in the last year, but the first meaningful law was the law on lustration, basically saying that parts of the former military, secret police, and so on cannot take high positions in government, and other countries like Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and so on have gone further and have said, you know, you cannot be part of political parties, you cannot be part of the banking sector, and so on, basically to ensure that these networks do not continue to basically retard reforms. The secret police is one such example. Across countries, it differs, but you need to think, why didn't reforms happen before? All right, because in a country like Georgia, okay, maybe in the early 90s it was difficult to do reforms, but why didn't reform happen in the late 90s or even the early 2000s? What prevented the then Shevardnadze government to do reforms? Actually, I don't know very well this question, but it had a lot to do with, how to put it, personal networks of politicians in power. So I remember having a discussion, for example, it's a random discussion, but you know, we had a lot of discussion. It made an impression on me. This is 2000, roughly 99, 2000. Why aren't there? Sorry, let me backtrack. In the US, in the middle of the night, if I basically don't feel well, I can go to the first gas station and buy some medicine, you know, aspirin, this kind of stuff. And you couldn't do this here, and actually a number of other countries in the region you still cannot do. So I asked this simple question, how come that there are no places in Tbilisi, downtown Tbilisi, where in the middle of the night I can buy simple medicine, not complicated stuff, just simple headache and so on. And the answer was at the time, because members, let's put it that way, of the Shevardnadze family control the gas stations around the country, and also control a lot of the pharmacies or the pharmaceutical outlets. So basically you're stuck. They don't want to sell you, you're not going to sell. Well, so who is against reform? It's not just, in this case, one politician. It's also the whole business empire or environment that they have created around them that stops, see a simple example, it stops reform in the energy sector, let's say, it stops reform in the pharmaceutical center. So you first need to look who is going to be against reform, the former road police in this case. Just try to dismantle these. You would still have resistance, but at least it would be less than what you'd have otherwise. And then the nature of reforms themselves, 10, 15 years ago when I was active here, it was thought that not just in Georgia, but for many countries, you need big expertise from outside on how to reform. By now you have the internet. Anybody who has access to the internet can, search pension reform and find out how other countries have done it. So you don't actually, the role of international institution in reform, it's not disappeared completely, but it's a lot less than what it was before. Basically, if a country wants to reform, they can do it on their own. They don't need the World Bank, they don't need the International Monetary Fund, unless they don't really want to reform and they want somebody to come and do it for them so that they can blame them. Say, see, it's not me that wants to reform, it's the International Monetary Fund. This is what Greece is doing now, trying to blame it on the International Monetary Fund. But you first need to see who is against reforms and try to diffuse this opposition before you can start. Other questions or comments?
Hello, good evening, and first of all, thank you for the presentation. And I wanted to comment about the Doing Business Index, which you have mentioned at the end of the presentation. So we saw that Georgia has dropped down to number 15 recently in the recent index, and as far as we know, this is due to the change in the methodology, and more so, and not about the major setbacks in some of the criteria of this index. But my question was not that. So I wanted to ask, what if someone, and in this case me and my colleagues, discovers that there is a major
flaw or omission?
No, there is a mistake in one of the criteria, so this means that Georgia could be on a better place as a result if this was amended. So have there been any cases when the World Bank was informed about some of the miscalculations and this was later somehow
reversed,
amended? Yes.
Yeah, there are many cases. Like most people in the World Bank also make mistakes. So that's why there is a process by which you can challenge any one indicator, either in a written format. So on the Doing Business website, there is an address that you can make a challenge, and then how the challenge would proceed. Or of course, you can do it with the local World Bank office and so on. Every year, I haven't been running Doing Business for some time now, but I ran the first 5 or 6 years, and every year we were getting something like 200 complaints about the wrong data, of which about 40 to 50 were correct, meaning that the World Bank my team at the time made a mistake, so we had to fix them. So it is entirely possible that the World Bank can make a mistake, and there is a good process of reversing such decisions, and it happens immediately. You don't need to wait until the next year. At least on the internet, the ranking changes immediately. So if you're interested, you can give me your contacts. I can put you in touch. It is indeed said that the let's say the less beneficial ranking of Georgia is due to technical changes of methodology. Let me just note that if it was changes in methodology, then every country should have been going down by a certain percentage. So it cannot be that arithmetically it cannot be that that it is just change of methodology, because then the ranking wouldn't work. So maybe, I'm not familiar with last year's data, maybe it's due to some of that. Maybe it's a polite way of expressing the changes in the ranking. I know of some other countries who also say that it's technical, but it isn't.
Thank you for your lecture. I was a little bit late. Maybe you were talking about this already, but if not, my question is: when Soviet Union broke down, we had the situations when countries which were part of Soviet Union had a situation when we had to decide between old regime, communist regime, and new approaches, which was West. Mm-hmm. And we were dealing with, in situation, we had West and our old experience. Different situation had the German state. German state was divided after Second World War, and later he was united. And I think, and you probably would agree with me, they had completely different situations. They were dealing with problems inside their own nation in one country. We all remember how fast it reunited that was German. So do you have any experience or knowledge what kind of successes they had, or what kind of problems they had, which will be useful for us to hear from you? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. It is indeed the case that some countries, not just actually in our region, increasingly in other parts of the world, also have reform experience, both economic as well as political, actually, or social-political, that one can learn from. Incidentally, there is a similar book written a few years ago on Latin American transition. Many of the findings, even though these are very different regions, are remarkably similar. So different regions, some of the findings are quite similar, but some, as you say, differ across countries. The transition process was perhaps easiest and most fundamental in East Germany, precisely because they had West Germany, because they had the Western institutions right there. They could see them, they could talk to their family members who were in the West, how it would work or not. So there was a lot of trust from the very beginning. Well, in our region, you start in some direction, but especially if the reforms are as fundamental as in Georgia, how do you know whether it's first going to succeed the way that the reformers thought of it? And second, even if it succeeds, whether the reformers are right. Maybe you go in some direction to find out, well, actually the reformers were wrong about this. So what do you do? Some of the examples in the Middle East point exactly in this direction, incidentally. We all, or the vast majority of people, thought 5-6 years ago that if certain regimes basically can be toppled and new regimes come, not only politically but also economically, things would improve. Well, so far, we don't see this in any single country in the Middle East of an improvement. So clearly our thinking was wrong. But in addition to your Germany example, I want to also point one other example that I've to some extent illustrated with Todor Zhivkov. Not only there was a difference, your own reforms in Germany versus other outside reforms, but some countries, Hungary, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Central Europe, people had memories of what was before. So there was a sufficiently short time, 40 some years of socialism, let's say, that the older generation actually knew the previous, not just the previous economic situation, but social situation, how you run private hospitals, for example, what was the education before the end of the Second World War in Hungary, Poland, and so on. So there were older and wiser people who could say, well, we don't need to learn from the World Bank how to reform the university system, let's say. Actually, I remember it when I was a young professor, and this is how we did it. And then the further east you went, certainly in most of the former Soviet Union, but also in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, we didn't actually have such memories. So even the older people couldn't tell us what was before, like, did we have a stock market before? Well, no, we didn't, unfortunately, so we don't have this expertise. So you have to bring it from somewhere. And then the question is, if you bring it from somewhere, do you have enough knowledge to adjust for the local civilization? Let's use your colleague's example. And in some cases, we did. In other cases, we didn't. And actually, some spectacular reform failures happened in our region and are going to happen in other regions as well. I remember one such reform, actually, that the World Bank was a big proponent of, which was to have local stock markets, including here in Georgia. So a team of World Bank experts and IMF experts went in the late 90s around the whole transition region and said, unless the Kyrgyz Republic has a local stock market, basically you're not going to develop well. And the Kyrgyz Republic and Armenia and so on had local stock markets. But since the population has never had stock markets, didn't know how to use them, the companies didn't know how to use them, they went in a period of 2, 3, 4 years, they collapsed. And there are many such, early on in the transition, USAID, the World Bank were very big on the topic of independent judiciary. But unless the judiciary is completely independent of the government, basically you cannot do judicial reform. In the majority of countries in our region, once you did independent judiciary, actually that became the most conservative part, the part that was against reforming because now they had all the power, so why would they want to reform? So in other words, there are many examples in countries like Georgia, to some extent like Bulgaria, that we didn't know what was before. People didn't have this legacy of this memory. It was imposed, if you like, from the outside. And the results were quite bad. Is there another way to do it? Perhaps. Knowledge is imperfect. Thank you.
Here, Simeon, you have a bird's eye view on the reforms in the region, and you've been part of the internal EU politics, at least on member of the Committee of Ministers of Finance, and you worked with the development institution. So what is unique in Georgian reforms which can be applicable to other circumstances? Or maybe the other view could be that Georgian reforms could have happened only under these circumstances, with that leaders and in this setting. Or is it something that is applicable somewhere else under other circumstances? So something which Georgia could have given to the, let's say, vocabulary of the reforms worldwide.
Mm-hmm. So first, it's actually not part of this book, although implicitly, since we only asked what we consider top reformers, so we did that. There is very little written in economics, unlike business, let's say, on the role of leaders, in this case, reformers. If you are in the business literature, they always write about the leaders, so you would hear the story of Google, you associate it with one person. You don't associate it with the many other good people who worked in Google or Microsoft or two people. Well, but one person gets most of the credit, but you're right. So if you go in most business reforms, either innovations or reforms of existing companies like General Electric, Jack Welch, everybody knows. In business, people say it's the role of the leader. In economic reforms, with very few exceptions like Balcerovich, we very rarely say that. But actually the leaders, after writing this book, I'm very convinced, matter a lot. So you can say that in 2003-4, Georgia was in such desperate situation that whoever took to power would have done similar reforms. But it's actually not true, because we know many other countries where the situation is as desperate as it is in Georgia 10 years ago, where actually they haven't done anything or are unlikely to do anything significant. Ukraine last year is a good example of that. This year we'll see where it is. But around the world there are many, many examples of countries in very desperate situation. There are no true leaders who come and basically change the situation. Partly, frankly, I've experienced this firsthand now in Bulgaria, that to be a reformer is a very ungrateful exercise. So you come, you do very difficult things, you change the status quo, everybody hates you, basically. And you need to pass a long, long time, hopefully, where there is enough comparison with other countries, there is enough writing, that hopefully you can start to be appreciated. So Balcerovich, since I know him quite well, it took about 20 years for Leszek Balcerovich, one of the top reformers in this region, to sort of have an approval rating of above 10%. So, he's a great reformer. Without him, Poland would be, in terrible shape. Still about 10-12% of Polish people think that, he's a great leader. Everybody remembers the hardship under him. In another 10 years, I think, a lot more people would appreciate him. And if you're just a true politician, we should say here, or perhaps in the next few days, that Kaka Bendukidze was not a politician really. So he had a particular point of view. He wanted to make Georgia a better place. He knew, I know in conversations with him, he never thought that he would have a long time in politics. So he wanted to come, change as much as possible for the better. And he fully understood that, it's not going to be appreciated immediately, at least, by the people around him. But there are very few such people in politics by definition. To be a politician, you need to feel people's love. So, most politicians are populists by nature. So having people like Kaka, there are very few around the world, is very important for reform. And I think very easily there could have been a situation in 2003-2004 that another government came, was very supported by international institutions, did nothing for a few years, and Georgia was where a lot of countries in the former Soviet Union are now, including some neighboring countries. So that's one. So leaders matter a lot, but given leaders, are there some examples that you can take from this chapter, from what Georgia has done? I think the main thing that even I am learning in writing this and presenting it is on this debate of how do you change institutions? Because I also subscribe to this view, it goes to some fundamental theories, that people's thinking, psychology is very slow to change. So you cannot come and say today, look guys, let's go through one difficult year, but tomorrow we are reformed, we are capitalists, we are innovators, and so on. It's not going to happen. It maybe takes a generation. We used to think 2 generations, maybe different education, different way of talking at home, what's important and what's not. Can easily take, I think, 50 years, in my view, for this current view, for this to develop. I think the innovation in Georgia, which no other country experienced, perhaps with the exception of Poland under Balcerovich, is that you came, the reformist, and in a very short period of time changed so many things that basically the old couldn't be around. Even if in 2006, let's say, or 2007, somebody wanted to say, okay, enough with this, we're going back, it's impossible. There are too many things that you need to change. So this sort of thing called reform blitz. How many other countries have done it in the region? Actually, none. You can say Poland did it. People say about Estonia. I don't think so. Estonia did a lot of things, but, not as fundamental. They were well ahead of everybody else in terms of income, in terms of institutions at the start of reform. So it's very easy if you are very close to where you need to be to say, I changed 2 things or 3 things. This is where I am. If you start from very far behind, like Georgia started, there, in my knowledge, no other countries, not just in this region, but in the world, that can do that. And this is why I look at countries like Ukraine. Incidentally, today we didn't talk about Ukraine and Kafka. Hopefully in the next few days you did. But he was very active in the past year in Ukraine. Some of that we discussed, and his view was exactly the same. Unless in the first 3 to 6 months you change things fundamentally, you've lost. This government, the current Ukrainian government, has been in power for slightly more than 3 months. I met them a few days ago. I'm meeting them again later in the week. In some sense, they've already lost, because a lot of the reforms that needed to happen, they haven't started. Maybe next month they're going to do great things, I hope, but this is you need to blitz. And I think people like you can tell us better why this happened here. But I think that experience in different areas is now used in many other countries around the world. Not so much, not as much as I would like it to happen, but it is used. Thank you. And thank you, I think.
So by this we can close. Thank you.